I'd like to welcome you and everyone else to this webinar today. We're talking about moving data from SharePoint to Microsoft SQL, and not just SharePoint Online, but all flavors of SharePoint. And we'll talk about that in a second to Microsoft SQL. As you know, we are famous for managing documents in SharePoint, whether they be policies, contracts, or just working documents, maybe project documents, and publishing information on your intranet, so building portals. But we appreciate that not everybody wants to keep all their data in SharePoint, and sometimes there's a need to extract it. And one way of doing that is using a product called SQL List, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So delighted to be joined by the CEO of Axio Works, Francesco. Good morning.
Good morning, Rupert. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Thank you for being here today, Francesco. So who's this for? If you're worried about system integration, so how can I get information out of SharePoint? Or legacy IT, maybe you've got an older version of SharePoint, or you maybe even running 2019, but you want to bring data out of that and maybe join it with other systems. This could be interesting to you. It doesn't matter if you're using SharePoint on-prem or in the cloud. We can talk about anything from SharePoint 2010 onwards. So I know they still exist. And the second piece is Microsoft SQL. Whether you're using SQL Azure or 2008 onwards, this is for you. What you're going to get from this session is considerations when extracting data from SharePoint, because there is more than one way to do it. We're going to take you through 3 live use cases, and they will be live demos, and one, as we got, AI art if possible. And then to wrap it up, we talk about the technical and commercial factors that you want to consider if you think this is a possible route for you. So hopefully by the end of this, you get all the information you need. As always, if anything comes out of this which you're interested in, do come back to me and we can talk through that. So today, we're going to cover the problem. Why do people want to do this? What are they up against? And we'll talk about some of the challenges and in our use cases. We'll then talk about the solution. There's a number of solutions, but we're going to be focusing on one, but we'll also tell you some other benefits and maybe disbenefits of the other solutions which are out there. Use cases, so we've got a number of those, and as always, Q&A. So if you've joined us through LinkedIn, put it in the chat there and we'll see what we can do to answer those. So without further ado, let's get on to the problem. What we know is that SharePoint's being used to collect more and more information. People are creating lists, which may be holding client data, or they're creating document libraries holding things maybe such as knowledge or contracts. And that information in SharePoint is great, but what the problem is, how do I use that information elsewhere? The other thing that we're seeing is with the advent of Power Apps, more and more applications are being created on the low-code platform to capture information, and that information then might need to be used elsewhere. So this is a really growing area of how people are using SharePoint. What we're potentially looking to do with that data is maybe produce reports. And generally when we're looking to produce reports, we're bringing data from different sources together under one roof. So it typically isn't just one list in SharePoint where I want to get data from, but maybe it's multiple sources or multiple lists. Maybe I want to perform SQL queries, so I like to get hands-on, maybe to do some join statements, group bys, all those kind of things, and I want to be able to query that data in a way that I can't do within the SharePoint environment. Another thing we see is a lot of organizations, strategy tends to be, look, we have line of business systems to do what runs our business, and then we'll use the Microsoft SharePoint stack to support the information around that. But how do I join those two things together? So we'll certainly talk about that. And then the last piece is AI integration. AI is coming. I've got this information. How can I leverage that information given what I can do now with natural language models? There's a whole load of ways to do it. A lot of people talking about co-pilots. We're going to show you a different way today. So that's the problem. I think, Francesco, what are some of the challenges out of the box where people think about, actually, maybe I can just start doing this myself? Maybe you could just talk those through with us.
Yes, well, connecting directly to SharePoint has got several limitations. There is one that is very well known, is the famous 5,000 item limit, meaning when you start having more than 5,000 items in a list, you need to start filtering and doing some views, and you cannot retrieve the whole lists. Other things are connecting to SharePoint directly is slow by nature, because you have to go through API. So when you want to retrieve data from multiple lists, and especially when you have a considerable amount of data, we talk about hundreds of thousands of items or even millions, then it becomes a problem. SharePoint Online also has got throttling. For those who are not familiar, is when you put too much pressure on your on your SharePoint site, SharePoint Online will say stop, give me a break, and then come back later. So you cannot really put pressure if you want to do particularly heavy queries. And then also the flexibility of accessing the data. It's all good when you have a couple of lists with a few hundred items, but when you start having multiple lists, maybe scattered across multiple SharePoint sites, and you want to have a holistic view of all this data, maybe doing some joins, that becomes virtually impossible directly from SharePoint.
Okay, so here's some of the challenges. Let's talk about how we might be able to solve that. So we've got data here. We know SQL can answer a lot of those. A lot of us already have SQL instances fired up. Even at the basic level, SQL Express is free. So let's see how we might want to join that information together. And there's a few routes open to us. Firstly, there's the Excel option. If you go into any SharePoint list, you'll see at the top there, export to Excel. This works for small to medium data sets. It works better for lists than it does for libraries. Yes, you can, and it's an ad hoc one-off piece. It's not going to be the answer if you're looking for more of a continuous sync, but it is a quick way to get information out of SharePoint. Tends to be end user based, and then they use that maybe to use that to manipulate that data. The next way, Power Platform option. If you are SharePoint Online, there is a premium Microsoft SQL connector, so you are going to be paying a bit more for that. You'll be paying Microsoft an additional fee, so that's beyond the Microsoft maybe E3 licensing that you already have. But what you've got to consider there is you're potentially creating separate flows for every sync you want to do between every list or library and Microsoft SQL. And you're also going to need the skills to A, build it, and B, to maintain that. So there is going to be a bit of overhead there. It may be you have people skilled in that area, but there is some considerations there in terms of the management of that. So an option there too. And then the final option is the one we're going to cover today, is a solution called SQL List. So SQL List, as Francesca's going to show us, is a service which sits between SharePoint and SQL, or say your SharePoint environments and your SQL environments to be accurate. And it's going to show us how we can get data from one to the other with a very low maintenance approach. Actually, so low I managed to test it myself, and I'm going to show you that in a second. So Francesco, I think we should dive into the first use case.
Yeah.
And now these are all based on what you've told me, other scenarios that you've done with your clients and what problems they've solved. So very typical scenario here. You've got a couple of line of business systems, one which does invoicing, one supply chain, and maybe there's some common data between the two. Maybe it's products, maybe it's customers, clients, different systems called different names. And either you've got somebody who's going in and typing something in system A, then typing in system B, and we're relying that they're using the same format and standards to copy those things across. Or B, maybe you've got it in one system and then you've built a custom sync to join that information together. There's other challenges with this as well, is often this data, people want to see this data, maybe who don't use those systems, and that's potentially where the SharePoint view comes in. So this was the scenario. And then, prior to this, you taught me through actually how you approached it. And we're going to see an example of this in a second. So you created a list of products in SharePoint for this example. You then use SQL List to sync that data from SharePoint to SQL on an ongoing basis, and then created views of that data for the different systems to consume in the formats that they need. So that's the theory. Why don't you show us what that looked like in practice?
Yes, absolutely. Well, you described the use case perfectly. So I'll go straight into the demo. So let me share my screen. We have a SharePoint Online list. We call it products. Actually, as Rupert said, these are real case scenarios. And we did have customers that needed to have this synchronization of product details across more than one system. So in this case, we have here a list with a number of products and some columns for each product. On this machine, I have a SQL List running, which is synchronizing everything to a SQL Server table. And over here, we can see just an extract of this table. If you look at what it contains, there are, I just doing the select top 5, we have the same data that we have on the SharePoint list over here. So how does SQL List works? When you do any change in your SharePoint lists, for example, let's create a new item called keyboards. And we give it a unique price and then also some stock. When you make any changes, like in this case, we create a new item, SQL List in the background will keep this data up to date to the SQL Server table. So if we go here and we refresh this table, you can see that the keyboards here have been added to the SharePoint to the SQL Server table. In the case of the use case, we needed to feed some of this data to one system and some to the other system. So as Rupert described, we created a couple of views like this. And as you can see, we have only some columns in one and other columns in the other ones. So in the end, there was no change at all to the two LOB systems. We were able just to rename the old table, apply the new view, and the system didn't even notice the change. Everything went live, and there was not even any downturn on the live systems. From then on, all changes were done in SharePoint, so it was very clear where the change was done and who was responsible and the flow of the data.
Francesco, I think some of the other things that people maybe take for granted in SharePoint is, and I think you touched on there, is one, you've got that security. So very easy to do granular security of who can do what in terms of permissions, whether it's a read view or a contribute view. We've got the audit trail, maybe the version history of what was changed and when it was changed. So you've got that additional advantage there. And as you'll see in the late stage, we can do things like put approvals on changes as well. So to track who's authorized to start the change, but who then needs to sign it off. The other thing which I really liked in there is that the calculated column came through as well. And anyone who works in SharePoint knows that calculated columns aren't always the easiest things to work with. So I thought that was pretty smart. I think the final point was just the speed. You changed something and it was pretty much instantaneous from when it changed from one side to the other. So yes, you could look at triggers and flows, but nothing works that quickly. So if speed is important to you, I think that's a really interesting one. Just before we go too much further, I think Francesco, he shared with me, said, look, download a demo, Rupert, and see how you get on. So I haven't touched SQL since 2000, where I actually qualified with my Microsoft SQL exams. But I did install SQL List Manager, and I just want to show you how easy it was. So what I did is, firstly, I clicked on database connections. So this is where I was going to store my data. And as you can see, I've created a SQL Express environment on my device here. And then I went to SharePoint here and I clicked on created a SharePoint connection here. So that points to a site with a username and a password. And then I set up a replication between the two. And what that did is identified which lists or document libraries I wanted to sync from my SharePoint environment into my SQL environment. And I did that in about 10 minutes. So it was super quick. And I did a little video about actually earlier, which you might see. So I just have to say the application was super easy to use. It wasn't overly complicated. And somebody like me can do it, then I think pretty much anybody can do it. Okay, so let's move on. So Francesco, second use case, and actually this is based on a scenario that I've seen, which is an organization, they create data sheets around their products. And what they look to do is publish those onto their website. So they're created on SharePoint, where we've got an environment which is got approvals and collaboration, and it's got editing. But then they need to take those documents and publish on their website. And when you're looking at a volume of documents, that can be quite a painful process, downloading from SharePoint and then manually moving them across. So what we're showing in this scenario is you've got the concept of an author who creates a document, who publishes it to a staging website. Then what might have happened is a Teams message or an email might go to the approver saying, hey, I published this. Do you want to check it out on the website? And then give me the green light, and then we'll publish it again into production. Obviously, manual process, potentially a lack of audit, potentially issues of wrong versions going to wrong websites. And so then we talked, myself and yourself, Francesco, about how can we use SQL Express to support this. So the example we're talking about here is particularly how could I publish a document out to a website? But it could be, I'm about to make some changes to a Power BI report. How can I do some test data to see how that's going to look before I push that into production? Or testing line of business systems, you probably have a test environment. And then how can I change and how can I reflect how that might work in a production environment and test that too? So this is the scenario that we built out, which was, look, the author and the approver both work out of SharePoint. SharePoint has approvals built into it out the box. There's one set of approvals. You don't need to be an expert to use those. And then based on what happens there, base shows where that document should route. So if it's pending approval, which should be familiar with that status, then we'll push it to the staging environment. Once it's been approved and that change comes through, then we'll push it through to the production environment. Now, we haven't used documents in this scenario, we've just used some list information, but the concept remains the same. So, Francesco, why don't you take over the screen and just show us what that looks like?
Absolutely. So approval is being enabled for this list. That means that every time you do a change to the SharePoint list, it will go into a pending status and then a different table. If you look here, we have a staging table over here and a live table over there. At the moment, they contain exactly the same data because all data on the list is approved. Let's see what happens when I go in here and I create a new recipe. Let's do one for a good English breakfast. I create a recipe, I give it a number of calories, and I give it some cooking times, and I save it. Now over here, we see that the new item has gone in, and it's in the pending status. So what do we want? We want to see this pending data only on one of the table, not in the other one. If we switch back to SQL List, we can see that here we have the English breakfast on the staging table. But on the live table, the item won't come in. If we refresh the table, you can see there's no English breakfast on the live list. So once the data is approved, checked and approved, we can go in here and approve it in SharePoint. So I go here, I select approve. At this point, no changes are done to the data, just the approval. There is no manual intervention that needs to be done. You give it a few seconds and you will see that SQL List automatically will publish it to the live database, and there it is. So as soon as the data was approved, it was not necessary to run a job or do some triggers or anything. Behind the scenes, SQL List took care of the whole thing and the data went straight to the live table.
That was, super impressive. Using out-of-the-box SharePoint approval, you may have a more complex approval process, and absolutely you could factor that into there as well. So maybe you have a multi-step approval process. But just one example of trying to make life more simple for people who get involved in testing solutions and trying to reduce issues between copying things between different environments. Okay, so we've got our final use case here, should we say real-world use case. And this one's talking about reporting on large lists. So as you may know, you can connect Power BI directly to SharePoint to do reports. Some of the challenges around that are when you're dealing with large numbers of records, and you could potentially put millions of records into a SharePoint list. It's going to take a long time to refresh that. The other challenge is often you want to pull data from SharePoint with data from other environments, join that together and present that as your model Power BI. So that could produce a challenge. And I think, Francesco, one of the things you said to me prior to the call is one of the biggest use cases where you see for your solution is where people do have these large number of records in SharePoint. Absolutely. And they do want to do those reports. So here's the scenario. Do you want to just take us through actually what that might look like? And I think what I find fascinating is the speed of which, if you update SharePoint, the speed that the Power BI report refreshes.
Excellent. Over here, what we have a list called Big List. This doesn't contain millions of items, but contain a few hundred thousands, which already would be a problem if you want to create live reports in Power BI based on data from these lists. This list is being replicated to SQL Server as well as all the others one, and here we have an example of the data. It's very simple, just a few basic data. In Power BI, we created a report, just a bar chart that connects directly to the table. In this case, also, because the data is in SQL Server, we were able to create a connection using direct query, which means that Power BI goes and retrieves the data directly from the data source, rather than having to import the whole table and then do all the calculation and generate the reports in Power BI. If you see here, now when I click refresh, you can see that it takes only a second to refresh the data. Just to see the whole thing with SQL List in action, you can see here that this group 4 here is the one with the highest value, which is over 4 million. If we go to the SharePoint list here and we take something for example, this item is in group 3, I'm going to edit this item and increase the stock by 5 million so that we make sure that this is going to be the highest group. Now that's gone in, the SQL table will be updated by SQL List. And because here we use indirect query, if you refresh the report, you see that immediately we have the data already updated in the Power BI report. One thing that I cannot stress enough is that speed by which you can retrieve the data. If you were to update directly from SharePoint, you would press this button and wait for all the data to be imported again into Power BI. If you have millions of items, it becomes basically impractical, if not impossible.
I think, Francesca, that's very interesting. I think a lot of people expect to see live data in my report, and you certainly showed an example there. And also, we want to see data from all our sources come together in one dashboard. So really interesting use case. Okay, let's keep going. Final use case. So document libraries hold information such as contracts. It's maybe project documentation. It could be knowledge articles, or it could be company policies. And people are thinking, right, if I need to ask a question, how do I get the information to that? So as an employee perspective, if I go and speak to somebody, I might be asking a question, what is my holiday entitlement? Or when do we start a certain contract? So these might be the questions that people are asking. And we think we are going to get there with Copilot, but obviously there's a premium attached to that. But I think the example here is really what I want to show you is a lot of organizations have information they maybe want to push out to websites and like that, but the website search doesn't do a great job. So what if there was a way of benefiting from the information which I want to share? Maybe it's documentation about your products or solutions, and a way that people can ask questions in a natural language format and give answers such as these. So in this demo, which Francesca's pulled together, what we've got on one side is SharePoint, and we're going to show you that. And actually, in this case, we're pointing to a policy hub. So this is a solution that we have called Policy Express for helping organizations manage policies. And these used AI to join it all together. Okay, so without further ado, Francesca, do you want to take over and show us what you've got there?
Absolutely. What we did in this case, we added an additional layer to integrate with AI, and this is the result that we're going to see. For this case, as Rupert mentioned, we're going to use an actual live policy document library from Information EXP, which is this one that we see. As you can see, it contains a number of documents of PDFs. These documents are being replicated to SQL Server, and then they go through all the AI system. And we created here a very simple interface to show what can be done once the data are processed in this way. So, for example, let's take a question that you would ask to an actual person or ChatGPT. For example, how many weeks may I take for maternity? When you send this system here now, it will go and retrieve the data only from the document library. So if the information is in there, the system will find it and answer in a natural language way. As you can see in here, it answered that you have 52 weeks, and it includes, there are 2 blocks of 26 weeks each. What is interesting to see is first that the answer is like if a person has given it, but also here you have the link to the actual documents from which the information was retrieved. So if you want more details or even just check that that is accurate, you can link directly to the document and look at it. Other examples, for example, you can ask, I have here another question, may I bring my laptop to the office? You ask this question and then give it a second and we see the answer.
I think, Francesca, just why it's doing that. Yes, in the Microsoft 365 world, people are looking at Microsoft 365 Copilot Chat. But I think when you're looking to roll out at scale, people are going to question saying, am I going to be paying $30 a month for every single person in my organization? Or is there a group of people, particularly maybe if you work in retail, you have a large number of people who are not using IT as much, who could benefit from this? I think there's a real potential here. I appreciate this is, proof of concept at this stage as an idea, but I think it's got some real value.
Absolutely. Here we see the laptop questions. He answered again, which is possible, again, showing which document contains those information. I think another couple of things I would like to show on this one is, for example, an interesting question could be, okay, which policy do you have information for? So if I take this question, yeah, what policies are available? This will also tell you, okay, what does the system know about this library?
And so this information is effectively live. We're not waiting, it doesn't come from a couple of days ago. It's what it's seeing in SQL right now.
Absolutely. And because SQL List is behind the scene and everything is kept up to date, if you were to add a new document, automatically the document will go through the process, take, say, a few seconds or half a minute, but then it will become available to this interface to be queried in this way. Here you see that it gave us, for example, a list of the documents that are available. One interesting thing about this, which is actually quite important, is that the system doesn't give you answers that are not relevant. For example, I have a question here that I know is not present in any of the documents in the document library, which is this one. How much does the company contribute towards my pension? If you send this question, the system will think probably a bit longer because it goes and look very, very carefully through the document library. But there is no document that describe this information. And in fact, there you go. This is the answer it gives. It says, unfortunately, there is nothing about it in here. And this is very important because it's important that the system, when you interact in this way, it doesn't make up things, which is something that can happen with AI system.
So what we're saying is it's only going to be using the data that you publish. It's not going to say, okay, if you don't know the answer, I'm going to go out to the web, for example. That information may exist, but I suspect it will be completely incorrect in just the context of your question. Okay, so I've just taken back over the screen. So we've been through the 4 use cases. What I just want to do now is just wrap up with the facts and the pricing questions. So as we touched on, we can take data from SharePoint lists, we can take data from document libraries, and not just the metadata, but the documents themselves as blob files, and then you can extract those from SQL and turn those back into the files themselves. As Francesco mentioned earlier, works with SharePoint 2010 or newer, works with SharePoint Online, works with Microsoft SQL Azure and SQL 2008, and a mix of those. In terms of installation, I think actually it's a low spec VM or put it on an existing server. It runs as a service. It can run in the sandbox. It doesn't need access to the internet. It doesn't send data to the internet, so all the data sits within your environment, particularly if maybe you're doing a SharePoint on-prem to a SQL on-prem. So we're not worried about data passing through maybe countries that you can't have it doing that. And then final 2 points, licensing and pricing. So it's licensed per instance and it's on a perpetual basis. That said, after year 1, if you're looking for additional support is an option open to you. And so for many organizations, 1 license is sufficient because you can point to multiple replications, multiple sources, multiple destinations, all within that 1 install. And then the pricing for this is, I think, very reasonable given that many subscription tools are charging this per year, and more is $6,000 or around £4,500, and that's a fixed price. It's not based on consumption levels or volumes of data. So really, I think that brings us as a wrap for today. Hopefully shared some useful information. Francesco, anything you'd like to add?
I think you said it all, Rupert, and yeah, that is it.
Okay. And I think just one question I've seen is that it is a sync from SharePoint to SQL. It's not a 2-way sync. So really designed as SharePoint being that source of the truth, and that's what it solves. If this is interesting to you, please get in contact with me, either from the contact us page on our website or directly through LinkedIn. But thank you all for your time today. I hope that was interesting. I think it's a really interesting way of solving a problem. Yes, there are multiple ways of solving these problems, like with all Microsoft technology, but this might be a fit for you. But anyway, thank you for your time and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.